All right. I'm Steve Bechtold. I am the pastor at the Sparta United Methodist Church and have been here for 4.5 years. I, uh, in my previous appointment before this, I was the Skylands District Superintendent. And while I was on the district, I started working with a few churches, kind of as a pilot project to look at how they could make their church administration more effective. These churches in particular were very small. Um, a church with a worship attendance of about 14. And not everybody was really up to being on committees and stuff. So that was one of the churches I worked with. Since then, I guess people got the idea that I know how to do this. So I've been doing this workshop 5 or 6 years now. And the and I have worked with churches that are considerably larger. This is not just small churches. It can be done with any size church. And um, the goal is to help us look at what does the discipline allow us to say and to do, and still follow disciplinary measures, because that is important. We have to remember that we live in a very litigious society. And one of the things that can be very dangerous is not following our own rules. Now, the discipline allows us the freedom to organize as long as certain things are met. And that's what makes a one board model possible. It is disciplinary. I will show you the paragraph. If you don't believe me, I would invite you to buy a book of discipline and read it. Understanding that by May of this year, it's going to just about be obsolete, and that will then become a book that helps you to level the couch in the living room or something. But it will. But these are all based on the 2016 discipline, and I will go through those. I've been a pastor for 46 and a half years.
You want me to use the headset?
Well, I was thinking of my phone.
So I've had a good amount of experience in there. I'm going to ask if you are not,
Maybe ask Barry to get it up for you, so you don't have to.
if I'm going to ask everybody
Probably be a rest area.
and if you want to speak, just unmute at that point so we don't get feedback from all over the place. All right, I'm going to share my screen kind of. I continue to. Okay. Let's see, is this going to be the right one? All right. I've been having trouble when I try to move this to full screen, that it wipes everything out for me. I don't know what's going on with my computer, but I will do that. So let's start here. You know, we're asking what's permitted under the Book of Discipline, so that we can modify or simplify our church's administrative structure. Let's start with paragraph 247.2 in the discipline. And that is that the charge conference, the district superintendent and pastor will organize and administer the pastoral charge in churches according to the policies and plans herein set forth within the Book of Discipline. However, it also states when the membership size, program scope, mission resources, or other circumstances so require, the charge conference may, in consultation and approval of the district superintendent, modify the organizational plans, provided that the provisions of paragraph 243 are observed. So everything we're going to be talking about is disciplinary. Even though it may not be what you've been used to, you may have done it this way for the last 50 years. This is all permitted within the discipline. However, there are some guiding, some guidance that comes there that are requirements. The first in paragraph 243 is that every church, and therefore its administrative structure, has three primary tasks. The first is to reach out, and receive with joy all who will respond, and encourage people in their relationship to God, and invite them to commit. So that is a primary task of the church. The second is to strengthen people in their spiritual growth and their spiritual formation. And the third is to support people to live as Jesus Christ calls us to live lovingly and justly in the power of the Holy Spirit as faithful disciples. Notice there's nothing in the primary tasks of the church that talks about the primary task is to have a worship service at 10 o'clock on every Sunday morning, or a Sunday school, or committees, or anything like that. Those are not primary tasks. Primary task is basically to be God's church in the world. And that's what drives us. In the same paragraph, though, there are 6 basic responsibilities that are outlined. The first one, and this is intentionally needs to be up on top, plan and implement a program of nurture, outreach, and witness for persons and families within and without the congregation. So in other words, nurture is worship and education, prayer, spiritual life that helps somebody to grow in their faith and invite people into faith. Outreach is mission and serving others and getting outside the doors of the church. And the third is witness. And this is not defined as going door to door and pounding on, handing out tracts and things like that. You can do that. Some contexts that works well. But to witness is to guide and lead and help people to be able to put their faith out there into the world, to show people what it is to be Christian, and then to invite people into the faith, to invite people to be part of this life-forming and transforming way of being that Jesus has shown us. So this is the primary ministry of the church. The goal is to have ministry first. That's the basic task. We have to be in ministry. The second basic responsibility is to provide for effective pastoral and lay leadership. Now, some may think that, well, we don't provide pastoral leadership, the bishop does that. Well, that in one way is true. However, to be able to provide for effective pastoral leadership requires having a compensation package. It requires having people doing or supporting the pastor in their work. It requires a whole lot of places or opportunities for pastors to share what's going on in their life. That's why we need something like an SPRC. I use my staff parish relations committee often to help me set priorities, because I know what I think I should do, but I also need to listen, and they help me be the eyes and ears. That's a support system. So we have to provide for that type of support. Lay leadership. We need to be providing for people to grow in their leadership in the church. And then the church is responsible for making sure that happens, because we need lay leadership. The United Methodist Church and Methodism was largely a lay-led denomination for at least its first 100 years. We've moved more and more to look at pastoral leadership, and pastoral leadership is important, but pastors cannot lead by themselves, so we need to be able to provide for that. The third, this is where we get down to more the administrative end of it. We need to provide for financial support, physical facilities, and legal obligations of the church. I think financial support and physical facilities you kind of get. And, but legal obligations, we sometimes forget we have those. And that can be, it could be as much as, first of all, making sure that you are properly incorporated. Making sure that you're following, that you have the rule book, so to say. You've got your own, this is why you want to do these structures formally, and that you're following them. Because the courts, by the way, just don't get involved in things like lawsuits if you followed your own rules. So things like that, you want to be following your own rules. It's a very important part of it. It's a legal obligation to have workers' compensation insurance. So these are some of the things that you need to be looking at. Number 4 is utilizing the appropriate relationships and resources of the district in the annual conference. If you're participating in this, you are participating in a resource of the district or the region. We're clustered in 2 different regions, but that's part of the annual conference. Using the resources that are available. Many churches use the Breakthrough worship series. Those are available, and there's a whole lot of other resources that are available, and so part of the basic responsibility is to use them, to be connected to them. Number 5 is providing for the proper creation, maintenance, and disposition of documentary record material of the local church. Okay, what does that mean? Well, you need to have accurate membership records and baptismal records. These can be very helpful as we're moving down the road, and we need to keep them up to date, but we also need to keep our former records because we're often being asked for that. But there are other things, such as minutes from meetings, particularly minutes from meetings such as a board of trustees and deeds and certificates of incorporation and all of those types of things. We need to have those and have them safely maintained. When I served in the Butler Church, we got notice from the state that particularly since we had a daycare center there, we needed to demonstrate that an oil tank that appeared on a survey and building plan from about 1963 was no longer there. Now you look at that and say, how are we going to know? Because in the meantime, the church built a new building on top of where the oil tank was supposed to be, and put in a parking lot there. The only way to do it would have been to tear up the parking lot and to dig, because we couldn't to dig and find out that there was nothing there. That was what it was going to end up being. Everybody said, oh, that had to be removed. Fortunately, one man, Al Morgan, I'll give him credit, he's since passed away, but he meticulously kept all of these things, and he found trustees' minutes that showed that when they built the current sanctuary, they took out the oil tank. And he had documentation of it that goes back to 1963. And I was serving in Butler from 98 to 2011. And because he had that, we sent it off to the state. It was a done issue because we kept the documentary record. We don't think some of this stuff is going to be important, but we do want to keep that as accurately as possible. And it's one of the things that the church is responsible for knowing where this is. I served a number of churches, and as superintendent, I was in a number of churches. You ask somebody about their files or something. Oh, I got that home under my bed. Now, I don't want to pick on the local church. I also heard that on district and conference things too. We need to have things in a place where people can access them. Because without that, we can find ourselves, having to spend a lot of time and energy and money on stuff we don't have to. Let's keep our focus on serving Christ and serving our communities. And then the sixth one, which is not sixth in terms of its importance, but the sixth basic responsibility is to seek inclusiveness in all aspects of life. So that includes racial and ethnic inclusion. It includes persons with various disabilities. Church I'm serving right now, in 1998, the Board of Trustees were discussing putting in a ramp so the downstairs of our building would be handicap accessible. In 2023, we put the ramp in. Now that, 25 years in the life of a church, sometimes it takes a while to get things done. But we saw this is that we can't say we're inclusive when we have half of our building unavailable to anyone who can't do stairs. And it's not just people in wheelchairs, people with canes and people with walkers, and it can be pretty we have to look at all of that, and we're responsible. The church is responsible for seeing how are we inclusive of all people and keep that always before us. Now, this is a warning about the one board model. While this is permitted, it's important to remember that the culture change is more important than the structural change. And what I mean by that is the culture of a church, is it controlling or is it permission giving? Does it seek to hold power or empower others? These are cultural issues. For an example of a church that, or any organization, but we work within the church, so I'm going to stay with that. A church that would be more concerned with control and power is a church that says that nothing can happen in the church unless the church council approves it. That if somebody has an idea, it has to go through a whole series of approvals. I worked with a church, was asked to come and do a consultation with them on this very issue of the one board model of this one area. And the church wanted to bring on board another staff person in a stipended position. So we're talking, and the stipend was $500 a year. So we're not even talking $50 a month. Given where the church was, my guess is that probably would have barely covered gas costs. Okay? They actually knew somebody who wanted to do this job. So the Staff Parish Relations Committee talked about it. They developed a job description. They even knew somebody who they thought would take the job. Then it went to the church council. The church council had some questions. And so they had a meeting and they sent it back to the SPRC to clarify the questions and further develop the job description or whatever it was going to be. Then it went back to the church council, and the church council said, well, can we really afford this? So then it went to the finance committee. And the finance committee then had to give its okay. And then it went back to the church council. So you're now, okay, SPRC, church council, SPRC, church council, finance committee, church council. That's 5 meetings. They sent it, they approved it, sent it back to the SPRC. We're now looking at 6 months and 6 meetings. And the person they wanted to bring on board said, I have other opportunities. I'm not waiting 6 months to come on board. This wasn't somebody within the congregation. And it all went for naught. Why should it take 6 months? And that all had to do with the culture of, no, this group does that, this group does that, we don't talk to each other. That's a cultural issue. So what you need to look at is the church culture. And that has to be at the very heart of what's going on. Is it a controlling culture? We don't want anybody doing anything unless we get to say so. Now, there are some exceptions. There are some rules that have to happen. For instance, your council is supposed to set policy. It should have some statement about what the values are. It has the budget. And there are some coordinating functions, but that doesn't necessarily have to happen at the church council level. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But so it's not like people are just free to do whatever they want to do. So we want to, there's a couple people in the church who want to use the church sanctuary as a roller rink because doesn't that sound great? And you might say, well, there's safety issues, there's insurance issues, there's all of these other things. That's policy. So it's not like you just go and do. But you get somebody who says, I know of one church, for instance, there were a group of people. They didn't want to be on trustees. They didn't want to be on committees. They just wanted to plant flowers around the outside. And so they called themselves the Garden Club. They met every week. Probably had more time talking and having coffee, but it was like a small group. And they kept the outside of the church beautiful just by keeping the flowers planted, the weeds pulled. And these people love doing this. Why do they need a lot of permission to do that? They weren't changing anything. They were just putting in basically annuals so you could see the beauty of God's creation around them. Do they need permission to do that? Do they need permission to put in mums in the fall or marigolds for the summer? I think marigolds are summer ones. They shouldn't have to do that. They could just say, we want to do this, and they should be given permission. Go. That's fine, trusting that this is their church too. This is not an outside group deciding we want to come and do this to your church. This is our church, and we trust. So that means a culture of trust, that people are going to be looking to do the best for their church and trusting that. That is something that doesn't just happen because you make a pronouncement. Building culture takes some time, but you have to start somewhere, and you have to look at how do we do this. Now, so this is why I say culture is so important. Because the reality is, and you'll see this again a little later on, if you don't have a cultural change and you don't have the right motivation, changing structure isn't going to do anything to help move the mission. It's not going to help you make disciples for Jesus Christ and transform the world. It's not going to help you people grow in their faith just by changing a structure. Structure is kind of benign in that way. But it can also be destructive if you're not careful. So, under our traditional book of discipline, and following things there, and these are things that we have to meet or provide for. The membership of the church council has a minimum of 11 people in offices, plus the pastor or pastors who are appointed. And that's a chair, a lay leader, somebody from SPRC, finance and trustees, the church treasurer, lay member to annual conference, president or representative of United Methodist Men and United Women of Faith, if you have those organizations. That doesn't mean, well, we have a women's group, but they're not a United Women of Faith. I served, 5-point charge when I was in seminary. We had 4 UMWs and 1 Ladies Aid Society. I think the Ladies Aid Society was unofficial as of like 1948 or something like that. I don't remember what the year was. But in terms of what the discipline said, they didn't really have an official place. Now, there were members of the Ladies Aid Society who were on the board, but it was, but the discipline says it's United Women in Faith. A young adult representative and a youth representative, the pastor. That's who must be on the church council. Now, you can add others. You can have other committee people. You can have a bunch of, people at large. The church I serve now, our church council has 2 members at large who are just good thinkers. They're good people. They don't have specific offices, but we just really value their presence on the board. And that's why they're there. And that's fine. And, the structure, you have a church council and all other committees feed into the church council. You have your trustees, your staff parish relations committee or pastor parish, whichever you have in your church, nominations, and finance. You start looking at these, and a lot of churches have a hard time filling even the minimum numbers on what they have there. 3 to 9 people, 5 to 9 people, 3 to 9. Then the finance could be whatever number you have. But if you go with the maximum number, it's 27 people to fill 3 committees. And that doesn't include the church council. And often you have people who are serving on a couple of these. And people get tired of going to meetings. Ask a pastor who goes to most meetings. They get tired of going to meetings when you're not getting anywhere. Because we're not bringing people together in the same place for conversation. So what happens is we take all of these functions plus the basic responsibilities and primary tasks and put them all into a single board. Now, why a single board? One is it reflects the reality of your congregation. There are just not enough leaders, and there are too many positions to fill. And you just don't have that many people. I did a consultation in a church a couple months ago, and they basically have 5 people who are able to come to meetings and participate. More than that in worship. A lot of them are older persons. Some don't have computers, so you can say, well, we could do it by Zoom. Well, if you don't have a computer, you really can't do Zoom. And there are other things like that. So it reflects the reality. The other is the reality of time. The way our structure is set, that when you are on one committee, particularly if you chair a committee, you then get ex officioed all over the place. And then if you're serving on more than one group, you can go to 2-3 church meetings easily a month. And people just don't have that much time anymore. I don't know anybody who's not busy. Everybody I know is busy. And so one of the things that it does is it just reflects that people can't come to that much anymore. And I find it difficult and I've heard people say this. Oh, well, I didn't come to church on Sunday because I knew I was going to be at a meeting on Monday night, and I needed some time to do something at the house or whatever. I would much rather somebody come and worship and participate in fellowship and connect with other people than come to a business meeting. So what do? Do we not use them, or do we cut down how many meetings we have? It does streamline the administrative work of the church, and it frees people up to engage in other ministries. The example I gave you of having 6 meetings for a one stipended position could have all been done in probably, I would say, 2 meetings, because they would all be sitting in the same room together. And I've sat there and you say, well, the chair of the committee's there. Why don't they speak? Well, because they'll say, well, I can't speak for my committee. I've got to bring this back to my committee. Thing is, in a one board model, you are the committee. So you don't have to go back and forth. So you can move from an idea to an action step a lot more effectively and efficiently. It's a more efficient decision-making process. And it will reduce the number of meetings. So that people aren't having to go to a whole bunch of different things. Now, we tend to think about this as being something for small churches. I know one church that uses a model very similar to this. They worship somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000. I don't know what their current numbers are. It operates more like a more like a board of directors for a corporation. But they limit what they're going to do. And it doesn't mean that they're making all the decisions, and this board doesn't, they're not the ones who come and make sure that the leaky sink in the bathroom is not leaking anymore and all of that. But large churches have gone to this as well. Churches I've worked with have been some very small churches. I just worked with a church recently that is certainly big enough to fill all those positions. They just don't want to do all of this divided work. They want to work together. So why wouldn't you do this in the board? Well, first of all, if you have a troublesome leader and you're going to use this as a way to get rid of them or to isolate them or to elect or to structure them out, it's not going to work. If you have a troublesome leader, you've got to deal with the leader. You have to be honest and talk with that person and figure out what's the issue and what's going on, because they're still going to be there. They're still going to be there. If you get rid of a troublesome leader by structuring them out, they're probably not going to leave the church. They're going to probably dig in even more. That's been my experience in terms of what I've seen over and over again. Somebody's no longer elected somewhere, and they get, even when it's disciplinary required. I've seen some, like the Staff Parish Relations Committee, because I had a limit of 6 years maximum, 2 3-year terms, and people who get very incensed that, well, why didn't you continue me? Well, the discipline says we can't, and they don't go away quiet. If they feel this is a power place, they sometimes, like, when we need to tighten up control. Things are too loose around here. It's the exact opposite of what you need to make this successful. If control and power are the issues, this isn't going to work. It's not going to be effective because it doesn't change the culture. Sometimes churches feel that, well, we have some good leaders and we have some others who aren't, so we want to give more authority to the good leaders rather than raise up other leaders. Again, it's kind of like tightening up that control and the power. Sometimes churches say, oh, we won't be bothered with any of this other ministry stuff. We just are mostly concerned about administrative and finance work. It has to be done. It's important that it's done. It's not, I'm not minimizing that, but it's like, I don't want to be bothered with talking about Sunday school or something like that. So we'll just do this, and then we can just say, that's all we have to do. And if the rest of it happens, fine, but we don't really. And the fifth reason it's not a good reason is if you think that a restructure will save your church. A structure is a structure. That's all it is. Just changing your administrative structure isn't going to save a church that's sinking. There are ways that will revitalize churches, but structurally, it isn't going to do that. Now, usually a church that's in that situation is actually operating as a single board anyway, because the same people are on all the committees. Sometimes I've been to churches where I've heard them discussing something with the church council, and then they will say, well, we need to have a trustees meeting to decide this. And then when you look around the table, and maybe there's one other person who's a trustee, everybody else is sitting there at the table right now, but they'll have another meeting at another time to decide something. I said, this is not a church revitalization strategy. There are many church revitalization strategies that I can't get into right now, and they vary from place to place. But just changing a structure, you're kind of still with the same culture, particularly if it's a power over culture, a controlling culture. If that doesn't change, changing the structure isn't going to make a difference. So what are the issues? You know why we might do it? Well, what would be the problem? First of all, there are a limited number of people in the decision-making process. There's going to be fewer people there. How do you address that? Well, one is, how do you communicate? How do you get other voices? How do you listen? And you can create all sorts of opportunities on how to do that. But it is a potential issue. And it depends on how you structure and how you operate. It'll make a difference with that. One of the dangers is you concentrate only on administrative matters and not the program of nurture and outreach and witness. And that's the program, not the committees. That is the program. And that's a tendency anyway in a church, where you go to a church council meeting and we basically only talk about administrative matters. Or what we do, and you'll see this later, this is one of my bugaboos, we put new ideas and new programmatic ideas and programming concerns at the end of the agenda after we've done the quote important stuff, which is building and finance. And I don't know how many of you have been to a council meeting where a treasurer's report is handed out and then the rest of the meeting is, you know, why is the electric bill that high? How can we save money here? Why is this way? You know, we can't, you know, we don't have any money. We don't have this. We don't have that. And you'll spend an hour or more not even looking at saying, what are we going to do differently or how can we address it? It's just, you know, it's hard sometimes. I mean, I admit and I really feel for church treasurers and finance chairs who can see that there are more bills than there is money in the bank. And how in the world are we going to do this? I get that. But everybody coming together and bemoaning the fact doesn't change it. And so sometimes we have to just look at how we do our agendas, but then program. What actually brings people into the church kind of gets put off to the end. And we don't really look at how do we make those disciples? How do we serve a mission? And that's really important. A third potential issue is that it can limit possibilities for new people being involved. So you have to think about how do we have a new person coming in? How do we get them involved? How do we hear their ideas? And that requires building a system to do that. It doesn't be a complicated system, but just something to say, how do we bring people, how do we bring these ideas in? And remember, according to our book of discipline, this is not, all meetings except staff parish relations committee are open meetings. So you can invite anybody you want to come to a board meeting, whether or not they have a vote is another story. But they certainly can come and have voice if that's what the council decides. And the other danger then is a small group of persons who control everything. One of the times I led this workshop, I think it was about 5 years ago. There was a group from one church, 5 people from one church attended. And they had one question they wanted answered. What's the minimum number of people that we need to do this? And I pushed back on that a little bit. But ultimately, if you're going to follow all the disciplinary procedures, the minimum number of people you need are 5. And they looked at each other and said, well, that works. We have the 5 of us. Now, I knew the church from the district where I was superintendent. So I knew the church. I knew something about this. And these 5 people were just convinced that nobody else either wanted to or had anything to offer. Now, I had met some people there. I would not have agreed with that and didn't agree with it. But that's what they did. That's the way they structured everything. It wasn't my decision. I wasn't the superintendent. I didn't sign off on it. The church closed about 18 months later because some of their people who actually could have been very involved in bringing revitalization and bringing new life to this church and really wanted to do it, all were excluded. And these 5, and some of them, number of them just left. And the 5 of them basically got to the place of saying, we're tired, we can't do this. And the church closed. That to me is sad. Now, sometimes churches have a life cycle. Sometimes they do need to close. But I don't think I think that was a very poor, allowed that sport to basically control everything. And they were convinced they were the only ones who had anything to offer. And in my way of thinking, God sees, gifts us in so many different ways. It's our job to keep our eyes open to see how all that diversity of gifts are available and can be used. So how do we make this successful? There are a number of steps. One is to create a culture that gives permission to people to experiment and to be involved in ministry. And that, and this is within the goals and the guidelines and the values. I didn't put it in here, but also the budget that's developed by the council. So it's all well and good to say, oh gosh, we would be able to bring a whole bunch of people in if we just hired a worship band. And that's going to cost us, I don't know, $750 a week. And it just doesn't exist. You can't give people permission to charge the church for things that there's no money for. You have to be aware of that. But there is a lot that we can give people permission to do. You make it successful for defining for the congregation and the leadership the purpose and the function of the council, and then what it is not supposed to be doing. You go back to those six basic responsibilities and the primary task. What do we do? And it doesn't say we run everything. It doesn't say we're responsible for doing everything. It says we, and I argue this with boards of trustees, including my own here all the time. It's not the board of trustees' job to do everything around the church that needs doing. There are some things that, for instance, we need to pay somebody to do because we don't have the expertise and we don't have the people. There are other things that we can do by ourselves, but it doesn't have to be members of the board of trustees. So, I'm a big advocate for doing things like, work days and find something for everybody from age 3 to 103 to do. Because there's always stuff. To be cleaning out a closet or doing something. Trustees don't have to do all that. All they have to do is come up with the idea and say, okay, this is what we're going to do it, and this is how we're going to coordinate. But they don't have to do all the work. Everybody does. You have to communicate with the congregation. You got to bring people on board. You have to listen to their concerns and their suggestions. One of the churches I worked with on this brought it to their church, and there were a variety of things that came up. First of all, what they were naming their leadership board, and people said that sounds pretty heavy-handed, and they started thinking of, yeah, it does. How about we do this or that? They did some really great listening, and they didn't fundamentally change their plan, but they tweaked it. And they put a few things in that they kind of intended to put in, but had forgotten. You think, well, we're going to put this in. And one of the churches that moved to this sent me their plan. and I had to approve it. This is when I was a superintendent. And I noticed they did not have a lay member to annual conference, which is a disciplinary requirement. And so when I contacted the pastor, I said to him, this all looks good, except you don't have a lay member to annual conference. He said to me, yes, we do. And then he looked at me again and goes, oh, I guess we forgot to put that in. We talked about it. We just didn't put it in. It was a simple little tweak. But sometimes you need other eyes and ears just to listen. Sometimes it's more, people sometimes feel like, oh, I'm not going to have I've been a trustee for, 75 years. I'm not going to be a trustee anymore. And it's like, you have to listen to what does that mean. Sometimes that's a relief to people too. Because again, just because somebody's not on a board doesn't mean they can't serve. And so that's really important.
I have a question.
Yes.
You're talking about asking permission of the superintendent for things that we have to do in the church. Where there is the anniversary of a church that are on its way, and I would like to commemorate it. I would like to do something for that day. And I'm thinking to do it not extravagantly, but big.
Mm-hmm.
Do I have to go through the DS for that?
No.
Or I can just invite the DS on the day to come and celebrate with us?
You can just invite the superintendent.
Okay.
Because that's a local church event, basically.
Yes.
And superintendent can be invited.
Okay.
The only thing that you can't do is make it into a church conference.
Hi.
Hi.
This is my granddaughter.
Hi.
Yes. Okay. Don't make a church conference.
You cannot hold a church or a charge conference without
Yes.
another elder presiding, and the DS has to approve it. But other
Okay.
church events, planning events, celebration events, all of that, you're free to do that because that's what the church is about.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you so much.
Another,
Steve,
yes,
if you want to switch from a full model to the one church model, do you need to hold a charge conference?
yes, you do, but I'll get there. Okay?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and I'll tell you why. I can do that right now. The discipline says that if it has been approved by your church conference or charge conference and the DS, you can do it.
Oh.
If you don't do that, you haven't followed the discipline.
Okay.
So, and I would like to say, you don't have to worry about that. But the time when I was on the cabinet, there's almost always a lawsuit going on somewhere. And the one thing you don't want to get caught up on is we didn't follow our own rules. And therefore, we become liable. It's just, you set it up, you follow the rules, and you're fine.
Yeah.
I shared in the last workshop my very first cabinet meeting. And this was before I was a district superintendent. Once you're announced, you start going to cabinet meetings and you basically observe. You have no official role. But that's partly how you learn to be a superintendent. And I'm sitting there, and one of the superintendents was talking about being at a meeting with an SPRC in a local church. And each person was being called out one by one. Well, each of the members of the SPRC were being served in a lawsuit against them for wrongful dismissal of a church employee. And the church employee was suing them as a church and as individuals for dismissing them and saying you weren't properly constituted. Well, they were properly constituted. The lawsuit didn't go anywhere. That was the only claim. It wasn't that, you know, that there was any discrimination or anything. They said, well, you just don't have the authority to do it. And they did have the authority because they followed the rules. But if they hadn't, then that could have left them open. And I would love to say that just doesn't happen in the church. There's a lot of things I wish didn't happen in the church, but they do because we're part of society. So, another thing that makes this successful, and I found this from one of the churches I worked with, and I thought that's a really good idea. And they have it set up. People on the board have very specific roles and others don't. That as new people are coming on, or if if they know that the chair is gonna rotate off, they assign ahead of time, like a whole year ahead of time, the next person in that role so they can be mentored by the person who's there. And I thought that's a really good idea. It's a better leadership development model than sending them to some seminar or watch a YouTube video or something. Not that these seminars are bad, but when you can actually see it up close and personal in your context, because it's, you know, for instance, if you're going to be dealing with property issues in a suburban or an urban church are very different than property issues in a very rural church. Some of them are similar, but then there are other things that are just very different. It's the way it is. You know, one of the property issues, well, not a particularly nice one to talk about. Our parsonage here in Sparta is within Lake Mohawk. Lake Mohawk has requirements for how often the septic tank has to be emptied. That doesn't exist in a church where the church and the parsonage are on sewer systems. It has to be pumped periodically. That's just the rules. Or if not, you can be fined. So that's why it's better to have, you know, there are local issues that are always involved in all areas of the church. So I think mentoring is a really good idea. A couple other things to make this successful. You have to get out of the idea that the council has to do everything. You use task forces, you use other committees, you can use short-term teams, and you can encourage people to create new ministry teams. One of the things that I have done is, instead of just looking at a traditional worship committee, I've done worship arts gatherings. And I've done 3 in a year. And the worship committee has some functions, but they don't need to meet all that often for those. The worship arts committee is a group that dreams about how can we make Christmas, you know, Advent and Christmas just different and look different and whatever, or Easter. And we can look at that. And when I've done it, I just announce we're going to have it. Anybody and everybody's invited. Somebody might come for Christmas, but not come for Easter. Somebody might come for Easter and not come for Pentecost. Somebody might come to all of them, but they come. And I did like 3 in a year. It's just a short-term ministry team, just as mission teams. I'm in the process of putting together a mission team from Sparta for Christian Outreach Project, which we've been doing for a while. It's not a committee responsibility. We pull that team together to do what we need to. After that, new people will create the team next year, and they self-select because it's what they're interested in. Another thing to make this successful is you develop an agenda and put priorities on the ministries of the church so that they don't get forgotten. And the other thing that makes us, the last thing I'm going to mention that makes us successful is you have a predefined process for the rotation of members. Nobody's going to be surprised that their term limit is up. And you rotate people off, and they can come back on. But you're not, you know, it's not a personal thing. And you do it in your structure, not as you're going along. So you don't get to somebody and say, well, you're not allowed to be on anymore. And they think, well, what did I do wrong? They may have done nothing wrong. No, look at the document we approved. Look at the way we set this up. No one's going to serve more than, let's say, 2, 3 years. So I'm going to very quickly, I'm not I want just show you two different models that I've seen used, and they're variations on this. Okay, these are not set. They're not in the discipline. You have to create these. But one, which I just call a single board model, a simple formula, you have about 11 or 9 to 11 people. You have a chairperson, recording secretary, a treasurer. If they're not employed, they can come. Anybody can come. A lay leader and lay member to annual conference. It can be either one person or two persons. That's pretty common in a lot of churches anyway. Where your lay member to annual conference will also be your lay leader. In the church I serve, our chairperson of the church council is our lay member to annual conference. But that's not by design. That's just because he's available, he likes to go, and he does a good job. You have representatives. Okay, I forgot to change this. My apologies to the women. It should be UWF, United Women in Faith, not UMW. Old habits die hard. You know, your fingers just do things when you're typing things in. If you have those groups, then you have a finance lead, a property lead, and a personnel lead. And these are people whose responsibility is to make sure that these types of items are brought into the council. They're the ones who hold the council's feet to the fire to make sure that the items that have to get done are on the agenda. So, the finance lead would be the one to remind everybody, let's say in September, we really have to get working on a budget for next year. So we need to start looking at what we have and what we've been doing, what needs to change, what needs to stay the same. And you have those conversations. It would be the SPR, the personnel lead would be the person who would bring to the council that we need to do the pastoral assessment and the church profile, the church conference. And that has to be done at these times of the year. So we need to make sure at those meetings, these things are on the are on our agenda or a plan for how we're going to do them. They don't do them by themselves, but they work with the council to make sure that happens. If you have a young adult or youth, there are a lot of churches that don't have young adults or youth. But the goal is to have those two representatives. Also, it helps us to meet the disciplinary requirements and the pastor. This question came up in the last workshop about what role the pastor has. The pastor by discipline is ex officio on all church committees. It does not say ex officio without voice or vote, except with your board of trustees. Your pastor has to be an elected member of the board of trustees to vote at trustees meetings. It doesn't even say that a pastor can't vote at SPRC. Now, I've made it a personal practice that I just don't vote at SPRC meetings, especially since a number of items that they have to vote on deal with my compensation package and other things like that. I just think that's a conflict of interest. I don't do it. I tend not to do it with anybody. I might offer opinions, but I let the committees make the decision. And one of the reasons that I do that, regardless of whether somebody is a church member or not, if they're on the staff, I still feel a pastoral role there. Very difficult to be a pastor and then also to kind of make decisions that may not be well accepted by them, because it could be something that a staff member doesn't like to hear. So, but that's a personal, the discipline doesn't limit me, which I kind of find interesting that it's not, but I just think from an ethical perspective, it works better that way. But that question was asked. The other thing that I recommend is that the nominations, there to be a nominations committee, and the majority, it has to be 3 to 9 people by discipline, that not be a part of the church, the simple formula. They don't self-nominate. You get a couple people, you're gonna have somebody on there, but you're gonna have somebody else not on there, so that you can keep rotating people on and off. So that they don't just look around and say, oh, we'll just continue it the way it is. And that's easy. It really is. And sometimes in the rush and all the things that have to get done in the church, it's really hard sometimes to take the time to start looking for new leaders. It's not just a simple thing. But that's why I think it's sometimes better to have people outside the council, because it's easier. Because I don't mind serving again, I'll serve again. Even though our rules say I'm not supposed to, I'll serve again. It's probably better not to. Now, there are a couple churches that have organized around a similar model, but they have felt that given their circumstances, and this is just an example of that they have enough trustee type work and personnel work that they actually need more than one person in that area. For instance, a church that has a number of employees, maybe they have a daycare center or childcare center that is owned by the church, and therefore the SPRC has some responsibility for personnel work there. They may feel it's just too much for one person there. Some churches have extraordinarily complicated buildings, and sometimes they feel it's just too much for one person to have to be looking at all of that. Or now this could be a task force outside of the council. Trustees are responsible for investments. Some churches have fairly sizable endowments, and you can actually set up a separate committee for that. But you may feel that, okay, we need somebody to look at property issues. We may need somebody else who's going to look, keep an eye on our investments. Now, they don't make the decisions. They have to bring that back, but these are the people who do the legwork and the research, and they bring it back to the council. A lot of churches aren't that complicated, so they don't really need that. It's the decision, the voting, and actual setting a budget and whatever. That's what comes to the council. So with your trustees, you might say, well, we've got a pretty simple building, but there's still a lot of work to do. True. You decide as a council, we need to get all the windows painted in the church, and then say, we've got a lot of people who can do this work. We've got a lot of people willing to help. So let's organize a day that people outside the council, we're going to ask anybody in the church who owns a paintbrush to show up with a paintbrush or do whatever that they want to. Again, this would have these subgroups, and then you have to have a chair, a treasurer, a lay leader, a lay member, and you may have others that join in because that's what works in your church. The church does have a church-run childcare center. You may want to have somebody who represents that group on your council because it could be such an integral part of your ministry. What you're not limited to is, okay, every committee in the church has to have a representative on it. This body is responsible for looking holistically at the whole church. That's a culture shift. It's not about getting people coming in and advocating for their slice of the pie. Now, this is more of a group, the church council then functions more as a balcony group, and they look down at the whole operation and give permission for people to do whatever, and they insert themselves where they need to. That's why I said like budget, coordinating, and that's why you gotta be clear on what your values are, your mission, or whatever. You don't want, you're not gonna give permission to do anything. But you do want to give people permission to experiment and try new ministry, and you never know when something's gonna take off. And because somebody had an idea. Or maybe they were at another church at one point, and they said, this really worked well for us. So these are the two different kinds of models and they all any model can be adjusted for your local needs. That's what the discipline allows.
Hey, Steve, I have a quick question.
Yep.
So in order to encourage people to go on their own and do things is great. And but who do they go to? And you don't want to. You're saying don't go to the council for approval. So we just had our first one board meeting. We went to one board and we just had our first meeting.
Yep.
So the thought was that people that have different ideas to do things. The thought when we were talking, and that's why actually I'm at here. I know a couple people went to the earlier meeting. If you're encouraging them to do it, who do they go to for approval? If they have an idea, if you don't want them to go to the council, I mean, do they go to the pastor and say, "Hey, I was thinking of getting a group together and doing, cleaning out that room upstairs, and can I go ahead and do it?" I mean, if you don't go to the council, who do they go to ask for permission to do anything, whether it's plant flowers, do anything?
Okay. The question is, what do they have to ask permission for?
Oh, I'll give you a couple examples. I want to plant flowers. Who do they ask that to? They go to trustee person, or do they go to the pastor?
I would say if it was in my church, I would say, yeah, ask the trustee lead, but the trustee lead could say, sure, you don't need to give you permission. If you want to do it, go for it.
All right. So say if they want to do a fundraiser and, I want to do a fundraiser and, I'm going to sell these books or something. And who do they go to for that?
Finance,
What's that?
finance.
Finance?
Yeah. They would just
So
look-
whatever you're saying, so whatever category the issue might fall under, they can go from one person from that category.
Right. And as long as it falls within the guidelines of what has been set up by the council doesn't have to vote on it. They don't have to approve it. They just look and say, the thing they may have to do, the biggest problem I find sometimes is just coordinating schedules.
All right, so how about if you have like a mission idea, like I'm gonna get together with some people, we're gonna cook some soup and give them out to older members of the church, drop them off.
I'd talk to the pastor.
Pastor, okay.
We're gonna do this. See, what you
Yeah.
want to do is you want to build a culture that doesn't look for permission to do something, but is given permission to say, we've got this great idea, so we're thinking of doing this. It fits within all of your parameters,
Okay,
so you don't need a council approval. Because
so,
let's do a soup sale. Soup sales do really well in the wintertime.
yeah. So it's basically just going to the person who really it's going to it's going to affect. I mean, whether it's affecting the church, it's a personal thing, would be the pastor. If it's a grounds item, would be the trustee. A finance would be a finance person.
Yeah.
Other than just not letting the people just go and do whatever. I mean,
It's yes and no. They also need to have permission, so that they can kind of move ahead with things.
so we try to keep a calendar. So if somebody has an idea, I usually tell them check with the secretary. First of all, make sure that's open. And then if it's something that's small, you can just ask somebody. But otherwise, you could have two people doing the same thing and they don't even know it.
Well, and that sometimes can happen. But again, you're looking at a culture that gives people permission to move ahead and not have to wait for permissions.
So
Because-
is it good? Is it a good idea to coordinate those things through the office, through the secretary? She's not a particular, she's, just coordinating what's going on in the church.
if your church has a secretary,
Okay,
you come up with a system that works for you. I would, if I was, didn't have that, I would probably want to have somebody who would be the keeper of the calendar. Might be the
yeah,
council secretary or somebody, because not all
Yeah.
churches have employees there. And you have to know the context of your church. That's
Yeah.
why I can't give you a definitive answer. This is who you always go to. In
Yeah.
your context, it'll be one way. In somebody else's context, it will be different. But what we have to get away from is you can't do anything until it's been through all the proper committee stuff.
Yeah. Well,
Because,
I,
you know,
when we had talked on the one board, if it's something like, something big, a big mission that you want to do, it should be presented to the one board first to make sure that we're all on board, everybody's on board with it. Is that a bad idea? They should just let people,
no, it's not,
run with a, what's that?
it's not a bad idea, but what you want to avoid is, okay, we're going to bring it to the church council. The church council says, yeah, this is a pretty good idea, but there's some trustee implications. So let's send it to the trustees and they can discuss it at their next meeting. And then the
Well,
trustees.
if you have the one board, there is no board.
That's what you do the one board for.
Yeah,
Everybody who is on the one board is a trustee. So they can
that's correct.
they're all in the same room, they're talking to each other. It's a great concept to talk to each other. And you can, without having to be referred around, which is what our structure tells us we're supposed to do.
Yeah, well, we have the one board, and that's the whole idea, is that we can move things along without having 3-4 meetings. So we have an idea brought, we can say, how's you finance? You good with that? You good trustees? Anybody have any issues? Okay, let's go ahead with it.
And you can do it quickly and efficiently. And people feel
Exactly.
empowered to even be on the board because they feel like they've done something. I don't know about anybody else. Meetings at the end of the meeting thinking like, we didn't do anything. We're informed of a lot of stuff, but we really didn't do anything. There's no action that came out of it, no plan moving forward, no new thinking. I mean, you don't always have to do something, but sometimes it's a matter of raising some things and you realize, okay, this is a direction we need to go and we need to think about that. That's action, actually. But, you know. Yes, I see a question, at least one question. If you unmute.
Yes. I have we don't have a single board, and you think move to one on the next year. I'm just want to make sure if I got this on the right way. When you're talking about the single board, you think make the things easy, okay? But we try prepare the members and take the members and the church on the same page for anticipate for 2025. Prepare the agenda, all right? And when you get to the church, the local church, you're gonna let them know what we are expecting living on 2025. That's gonna give the church and the people in the church the opportunity to participate in the process. Oh, I would like to make a movie night. I would like to have a concert on the weekend. Okay. If that's in our agenda, it's in our goal. Yes, it is. Go ahead. Because sometimes the people have the great idea, but they don't want to do nothing. No, if you have a great idea and that's going to be in agenda in 2025, you have to help in a certain way, because you want to bring the people inside of the process to do things in the church, give them not the responsibility, but the chance to do something, and make this process easy to them. Oh, I want to make movie night. Oh, you have to wait because you have to bring this to the board and vote and see, and the time passed, and as you said, nothing happened. Because sometimes the people say, I don't think this is a good idea. I think it is. But the most of the time you lose a good chance, good opportunity to do a great things. That's why you want to bring the single board, because you don't have to be a big group, because sometimes some people they can't, another time they can't. You know, it's hard to find a day and the time to get everybody together, and sometimes it's really hard to get in how you say that, in concern. It's a, you know, and that's why you think to move on the single board, make the thing easy, bring the people inside of the process, but before everything, create the agenda and prepare the people and let the people in the church know about that and put everybody in the same page. Is that what a single board is about?
Yeah, so let's use the movie night example again. Why would a board have to approve that? Somebody can say, I want to do a movie night for the church. I want to do it, the first Friday of next month. What's the worst that can happen? Nobody comes. What's the best that can happen? It could be something that leads to an ongoing ministry. And so what we have to do is get away, well, it's got to go to the church council and we've got to approve and what's going on here, that, whatever. You talk to somebody. I always like the idea, and this is not original to me, but if somebody came to me with an idea, I said, do you have another person who you can work with? Because sometimes when two people work together, things happen in ways that when one doesn't. The board doesn't need to get involved in it. They've already said, the building's here. These are the parameters. I know one pastor, Bill Eason, was a church consultant years ago. And he said in his church, he always had two rules. Or two questions. One is it illegal or is it immoral? As long as it wasn't illegal or immoral, go ahead with it. I would like to add a little more than that. I would like to say, is it helpful? Does it forward our values? So there are a lot of things that are not illegal and that are not immoral, but they don't. So, a movie night, go back to that example, that can be a really valuable thing. It just fellowship, bringing people together and meeting people. So you don't, the one board model says, you really don't need to coordinate. You need to coordinate the time and the room and the time, because we don't want two things going on at the same time. But go with it. If it works, great. If it doesn't, what have we lost? We sometimes, failure to act can be just failure completely. Don't try things new, you're never going to get anything. You keep waiting for the perfect time and for the perfect plan. Sometimes it just never happens. So that's it. See, that's one of the advantages. You don't have to bring everything to the board. You do. You have to define what has to come to the board and what does not. And that takes a while. That's a cultural change in the church. We're so used to having to get permission to do something. And what you have to say is you already have permission. We had a question. Yes, go ahead. Could you unmute?
Thank you, Steve. Part of my job is to, develop and build a strong relationship between the staff and the congregation. And I'm asking about the congregation. Are they supposed to be part of the decision making that is really going to affect them? Is it right to listen to them and hear their own opinion? Because some of the leaders will be like, well, it has been decided upon and approved, and there is nothing anyone can do about it. So how do you handle such leaders?
Okay. Let me kind of move there. All right. And I'm going to come right to that. When I look at process, come on, there you are. First of all, in order to move to this within the disciplinary procedures, you have to develop a plan. It can be done with the church council. It does need church council requirement. They may want to give it to a separate group or a smaller group of people. They approve it. Then my recommendation, make it successful. You plan for conversation within the entire congregation. You send out your plan. You let people know this is what we're thinking about. We want your feedback. We want your ideas. We want to hear your concerns. You listen to what everybody is saying. That's an essential part of changing anything that is going to change this kind of structure. You want to take your time with it. I had one church that called me, asked me if I could do a consultation with them, because they were told they had 6 weeks to get a new plan in place. And Jess, I said, well, I can help you put the plan in place, but I can't help you do it in church because you need to talk to people. And I worked with another church, did an excellent job of doing this. They were so good and it was during COVID. So they had to do everything by Zoom, but they had 3 or 4 information sessions and they changed their plan based on what the feedback was. So and some of it, most of it was pretty small, but it told the congregation what you say is important. The plan then gets sent to the district superintendent. The district superintendent must approve it first. And then it is voted on by either a charge or a church conference. My recommendation would always be that it is a church conference because that gives all professing members of the church the ability to vote up, down, or abstain. Then after that, you work on your nominations report and to make it consistent with that. That's the last step. So you actually fill the positions. The reason, but in that way, when somebody says, well, they just made all, those people did all that decision, you can say, but wait a minute, we did this, and this. Having worked for the annual conference, and I'm, as a superintendent, now I chair a conference committee, and I hear the conference is making us do this, and I'm thinking, well, you voted on it. This came to the annual conference session. This was not something, it's like, well, where did this come from? Right? It was all up front. It was a report. It was other. People have to take other responsibility for actually doing that. It's not part of the process for getting this approved, but I think what's most effective is when then the council plans on how do we report to the church. I did a consultation in November with a church, and they were debating what was the best way to communicate. You can put it in the newsletter. Somebody said, should we send out the minutes? And what somebody says, minutes aren't really that helpful. It doesn't tell the story. It just tells the actions. Somebody else said, well, we can put an article in the newsletter. And people were asking, well, how many people read the newsletter? Their decision was once a month, they were going to have about a 3-minute to 4-minute opportunity during worship to talk about where the church was moving based on what the council was doing. That may not work with your church. Other communication levels are always there, but I think it's important that you build into this some way of communicating what's going on so people don't feel it's just this isolated group of people and they're doing their own thing. Another thing to do is to be very public with, the council is going to meet, and I wouldn't suggest you announce it Sunday with a Tuesday meeting. Like, the council meets a week from Tuesday. We would love to hear any feedback you have. And the council members are all listed in our bulletin. Please feel free to contact any of them. That way you're giving people an opportunity to give their feedback and their opportunity and a chance to have, in my church here in Sparta, I would say the best way to get the best information is coffee hours. They stay forever, coffee hours, which is fine. I'm glad they do. But we get a lot of information that's shared as people are sitting around having a cup of coffee and they stay for a long time. Not every church does that. That's our church culture. So it's not like, well, this is the great way to do it. Every church has their own way. We have some churches, everybody reads their newsletter thoroughly. Other churches, it's very disturbing sometimes when we put a newsletter out monthly and somebody said, well, when was this decided? Or my favorite, now I started in November. People said, when are we having Christmas Eve services? Why aren't we telling anybody? I said, it's been in the last 2 newsletters. It's in the bulletin every week. we run an announcement video at the beginning of worship. How many more places? I even announced it on Sunday mornings, and there were people who still didn't know what it was. You know, you just have to know your context, and you do that. And in that case, you know, I was particularly delighted that they wanted to come Christmas Eve. So we celebrate that, but it doesn't always go right. So there are a few things you do need to be aware of, just in terms of following some disciplinary procedures. While the discipline calls for youth and young adults, legally, a young adult, or a youth, anybody who's under 18, cannot vote and be considered a voting member of the body that serves as trustees. That's a state law that, you know, they can participate in all the conversations and everything else, but when it comes to a vote, they technically are not, because it's a legal matter. And that would not include things like, it's not, while trustees have responsibility, it's not a legal matter if you're gonna have a cleanup day at the church. So you have to use a little bit of judgment there. Also, the state law limits the number of trustees to 9. So if you're gonna have more than 9 people, you have to designate who are gonna be the voting people for trustees matters only, for those property issues. And if you do that ahead of time, it's not like somebody feels like, can't do it, well, this month I'll do it, and next month you'll do it. It has to all kind of happen. It should all be done ahead of time. SPRC, that's limited to 9 members. That may be a good way to limit the size of your council. Plus the lay leader and the lay member to annual conference. So it's really 11. And the pastor does not count in that number either, because they're ex officio, they're added on. The limit is that you can't have, the 2 limits you have to be aware of. You can't have 2 members of the same family living in the same household serving on that committee. So if you have 2 members from the same household, you just decide that, well, one of them is the lay member, oh, can't do lay member to annual conference. One of them is the secretary to the council, and the other is just an at-large member. You can just say the secretary of the council is not part of the SPRC decisions. And again, these are the nitty-gritty personnel decisions. These are not the decisions that, the example I used before was our church was planning a farewell for a staff member, and that was done through the SPRC. That's not a confidential personnel matter. The only person we wanted to keep it confidential from was the staff member, because we wanted to be somewhat of a surprise. But that can be discussed by everybody. That doesn't have to be SPRC. But when it comes to things that require those votes and things, it's really important, especially around hiring and firing. They're the ones where we're most vulnerable. So you want to just know who is going to be the voting members of those. The other thing I would advise in terms of the one item in SPRC, and that deals with the advisory section of the pastor's profile, or the church profile. That's where you inform the bishop whether you think the pastor is doing good ministry and should stay, whether you need to have conversation, or you think there needs to be a pastoral change. That could be very sensitive, and that would be better. You also can't have staff members participate in that kind of stuff. So you just isolate those items into, let's say, the end of the meeting, and those people who can't participate can go home early. I don't know anybody who says they're upset about having to go home early from a meeting.
Hey,
So-
Steve,
Yes,
I have one more question. So the one board meeting would be just like if you had a regular ad board meeting, it's open to all church members, correct?
correct.
So if you open, the idea of the one board meeting is to try to shorten and keep the meeting from getting into a 3-4 hour meeting, and try to keep it under that 1 hour, 1.5 hours. Do you limit when the congregation comes in to what's going on, or you just leave it open?
That's up to you. I would say there are a number of a number of churches. See, people can come in. They don't have voice and vote. So you kind of assess. So anybody can come, but they don't necessarily have the ability to speak.
Well, it's a good idea to have them. Good idea to have them come to see what the board is about, so that they feel included.
And then you just have, and the other thing to do, I have been in committees and I've loved them, where they have said, we are adjourning in 90 minutes. And anything that doesn't get done in 90 minutes doesn't get done. Unless the board votes to extend the meeting by a certain amount of time. So they might say, okay, we need to get this done. Would you approve 15 more minutes on the agenda? And they have to vote on it every time. And I have been in meetings where they've said no.
Okay.
But sometimes when you don't have it open-ended, when it is, we've got to get everything done, somehow we manage to get it done. And I think that's that's about meeting management. And I've done a whole other workshop on meeting management, but I can't do that here. I can't even get this all in. And I know it's a lot of information. So the PowerPoint slides that I had up, I will be sending to everybody. I will send the recording of the workshop and or the link to that. It'll be a YouTube link. But it's going to take me a little while to get that done today. And any other questions? Well, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of today and weekend. And I forgot to tell you this. One of the things that I have offered on all of my workshops.
And laundry and laundry and laundry and laundry.
Need to look it over. Email it to her. And you'll have my email address because I'll send. I have gone to at least 12 to 15 churches. To individual consultations on this. Why I that's all this, I don't know, but I do. So I'm glad to come out as long as you can be flexible and we can do that together. I will come to a church in person. I also will, I can do Zoom meetings too. Depending on. So I'm here to assist you if you're moving forward this and move this way and you want some assessment later on, which somebody asked me about doing, I'm probably going to be doing that. Going and how could it be made more effective? Hey, everybody. Take care. Have a great day. And thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Bye.